I wonder if we can start though, and because I actually wanted to do the check-in a little bit more together, so versus just dropping it into a chat. So this conversation is focused on impact investing and how do we address questions of gender-based violence within impact investing. So my opening question was, what are you bringing from other conversations in Convergence? Like your sort of your framing conversations or the opening session or the check-in or the thing we did yesterday, the roundup. What are you bringing from your other conversations into this conversation about impact investing? Anybody want coffee?
Hey Joy, I can jump in. It's 9 a.m. over here in Eastern Time, Canada, so I feel like I have had my coffee. I should speak. Great to meet all of you on the call. Yeah, I think a couple things are kind of sloshing around in my mind. Maybe I'll mention two. One is I came from the survivor lens group, seeing investments through a survivor lens. That was excellent, kind of grounding in, I mean, I think that was a segment of GBV, you know, the response side versus maybe the preventative side we were talking more about, but just to really remind ourselves to be grounded in the experience and not to speak on their behalf or think what we, you know, have our ideas of what is best for them and impose those on them. Just really to be centered in the problem and create solutions based on what really survivors see as necessary. The second thing I'll mention is, Joy, during your context session yesterday, I think some of the slides said, you know, either you use the system or you kind of work outside the system in creating social change. And I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of, I work at an organization that is very much based on market-led approaches and how do we harness market forces to drive social change. And sometimes I ask myself, you know, what about, and I think Bonnie Folly Wong put a comment on this in this conversation, which I really appreciated too. How do we question some of the rules of the game of the way markets operate? How we have to, you know, for example, quantify social issues, the prime, the short-term timelines of investments, those kinds of things are sort of bouncing around in my mind at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. That was great. Anyone else? Call on you. That'd be easier. Keep going with that one then. Lauren, you want to go? You're on the top of mine. We can sort of go Lauren, Regina, Teen.
Sure. Thanks, Joy. So from an earlier conversation, we talked about the cultural context in which we operate with different cultures and how to be aware and sensitive to the different cultural contexts for making investments and transforming societies. There was an example that was used in the conversation about, I think it was in the Middle East, where women were talking to the local imam and saying, we need to get your support in order to build a groundswell for change. And so that, you know, that's given me an opportunity to think about alliances and using alliances effectively in a cultural context. It's one thing just to structure a transaction. That's what I do in my job at the Development Finance Corporation. And I think many times I'm operating in a vacuum and thinking about a transaction using some of the terms that you outlined yesterday, Joy, in your context conversation. And I need to think a bit more broadly about the the way to view that transaction within a larger set of actors and you know, kind of the community and the society. So that's one of the things that I'm kind of taking away from an earlier conversation and thinking about, okay, how can we best do that? At DFC, we tend to think about alliances just in terms of co-investors and investees and just sort of the financial infrastructure and ecosystem. And I think that it's a very narrow mindset if you approach it just that way.
Well, I think I think that's a thread throughout a lot of this. And while it may be a narrow perspective, it's also a really, really commonly held perspective. And so it's a large number of people for whom that's what investing is about. Welcome, Rosalind. We're just the questions in the chat. Good afternoon. Regina, how about you? That's a great build on of what can you do in transactions to make all of this work?
Yeah, I was going to say, Lauren nicely set the floor for what we do. So I work with Convergence, which is different from Joy's Convergence, but we are the platform for for blended finance. And what Lauren says very much resonates with what my experience has been, because I do think that a lot of times what is really important in trying to increase the flows of finance towards SDG related projects, whether that's gender or infrastructure or energy, is that translation between the local knowledge that's related to the project and the financial knowledge that's needed to put that transaction together. And I feel like that in the gender space, there's such a big gap between that gender related knowledge that's so important to make sure that that work that's been done on the ground is actually helpful, and the financial knowledge that's needed to put that together. So I always find that at Convergence, we kind of play a role as a translator, trying to bridge that gap and trying to tell that dear sponsor who came up with that great idea of fundraising with a gender lens, and telling him, okay, these are the things that you have to emphasize towards these types of funders. And if you talk to a private investor, maybe you're useful to use this and this and this aspect of your transaction, right? Because I feel like today, a lot of times it's about packaging the information in the right way so that the people actually understand what you're saying. And there could be 10 ways of how you phrase something, depending on who you talk to. And so I find that what we have to work on in the impact investing space, and a lot of blended finance involves impact investors, is make sure that the gender related knowledge is being heard and is being understood. And I know that, Joey, that's also something that you tend to mention in a lot of your sessions, and that it's also being valued and taken into account. And I still have some questions as to how that can best be done, because I find within the gender space, there's a lot of people who do listen to each other, but it's not necessarily that within, you know, when you go to a broader finance conference, that the gender person will be the one that gets the stage for the longest time. So that's something that I'd be interested to explore.
Yeah, that's great. Tine, how about you? What are you bringing from other conversations into this one?
Yeah, morning, Joy. Thanks so much. I think I keep coming back. I mentioned this briefly in the chat yesterday, but I keep coming back to your introductory comment about sort of who gets to be the expert, who gets to choose that. And I, you know, I'm always sort of looking at the really massively big picture. I mean, our tagline for Rockflower is radical idealism practically realized. And the point of that is looking at these enormous problems, and then, you know, we really do narrow down to whether it's sanitary towels or seeds or whatever it is that's needed within that 5 key framework. So I think what I'm bringing, I was also in the survivor lens conversation, which was really helpful. I think what I'm bringing from all of this is this sort of needing to step back, and sort of other conversations also that I've been in recently. I mentioned Jason Hickel yesterday again, you know, this idea of degrowth, and you know, is that really the way that we need to be thinking as we really take a massive step back and changing the systems, changing everything that we thought worked, and therefore obviously how we look at gender-based violence within that context. So less is more, you know, let's stop talking about GDP and growth, and let's start talking about other measurements. And I think just, you know, again, kind of going back to your point, which I've picked up on before, is how do we change the mindsets? You know, I think Tim mentioned this yesterday in the roundup, but get, you know, from a getting to a giving perspective mindset, from an extraction to an inclusion mindset. So those are all things that I'm sort of thinking about and pulling in the threads, you know, kind of as we go along.
You guys got some deep thoughts for 9:12 in the morning, or as I run down other time zones. Siri, you got deep thoughts for 11:12 in the evening?
Yes, tired thoughts, I suspect. Look, you know, agree with all that's been said, and I guess the session that I got a lot out of yesterday, my time, was the megatrends, and looking at whether or not GBV can even be considered a megatrend, and that's led me to think a lot about a range of things, but in particular data. And if we did look at it as some form of trend setting, or looking at where the future's going and therefore pivoting, how can we use movements, if you like, or trends like the climate space to get the data that we need to the people, both on the ground, but also in the financial institutions, so that they can make the right decisions. So, you know, and I've been thinking a lot about whether it is a mega trend as well. I mean, or is it just where we sort of started to talk at the very end at quite a high level, the big picture of, well, what's the future look like? And so much of the world today, when you look at the stats on gender-based violence, it is a part of our systems now. So I agree with one of the previous speakers in saying that we need to really reframe our language, where we place value on everything. So how do we start to do that within the finance ecosystems as a starting place? But again, you know, for me, I've been thinking a lot about where can we get the data to start to build the frames to get the metrics for the different industries and sectors.
Yeah. And I think for this impact investing conversation, the question of if it's seen as a mega trend, if it's like sort of how do we get folks thinking about it in a big enough frame, which is part of the question around the mega trend, that it's not like this thing that happens to a couple people off to the side. Not sure mega trend's the right way to frame that, but
yeah. And I think, you know, in thinking about trends, just to finish up, you know, some of the stats coming out as there's a trend around women holding wealth in the world, or a very small proportion of the world in one sense, but in the developing or in the developed world, in Australia, women are starting to obtain quite a lot of wealth. So there's a trend towards, I think, a shift potentially in women investors making decisions differently, which will have influence on the finance sector. So, you know, that's a trend that has to be taken into account. Some of the superannuation funds here in Australia, you know, 80% of the funds they manage are women's superannuation. So we've got, there are these movements that are sort of little trends, but if you look at them holistically across even certain places in the world, perhaps that's a starting place.
Great. Rosalind, thoughts about what you're bringing in from other conversations into this one?
Hi everyone, sorry I'm late. A lot has been going on in my mind, especially after last night's my night session, the 5 points. And one of the questions I've been grappling the whole day today is what does the future look like for grassroots women organizations? Because if we can be able to put that grassroots vision in a picture, then we can translate it to the impact to our beneficiaries. And so looking at the 5 strategies you shared yesterday, one of the questions in my mind, do we move from database metrics or do we to evidence-based metrics? And so if culture is the barrier, if women can't own land, then can investment and resources be you know, tailored in a way that they can break that barrier so that women can be able to access those spaces and land rights and opportunities and resources? And can we then the process, the whole discussion we had about the process is the future. How then do we look at policy? How then do we look at education and creating awareness? How then does that translate in a language that the women get? Grassroots organizations also buy into it, translate it into simple language that they get and understand, and then finance also be able to build towards it and work with it. So I am still in the space where I know this is the moment and how to bring all that into a perspective, but translate it also to the grassroots women in a language that they understand.
Well, last but not least, welcome. I'm going to ask you because I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name, but we've met, haven't we?
Yes, we've met through Women Moving Millions.
That was what it is. I remember I was in some cocktail party with you for sure. But welcome. So glad that you're here. And can you help me out on how to say your name?
I'll help you on how to say the name. I'll help everybody because this is the phonetic. This is how it works. Judith.
All right. That's very helpful. Thank you so much. What are you bringing from other conversations into this one?
So this is my first Criterion conversation that I've popped into. I just got off a transatlantic flight from Israel to New York, so I'm not quite sure what at all at the moment. That being said, I have spent the last 3 years fully invested in violence prevention education, primarily through supporting empowerment self-defense, because I've seen the statistics and I've seen the research and I know it works. I also have had the privilege of conference hopping before COVID stopped all of that, and have been pleasantly surprised at what the young women are asking for and sorely disappointed in what we're giving them as answers. Because young women are asking to learn how to defend themselves and how to feel safe walking around in any situation they're in. And with all of the bias that we carry over the last 50 years of whether or not women should be learning self-defense, we're not listening to them. And for me, that's profoundly sad, because that's what they want. And so that's my corner of the sky, and what I'm working on. But
I have actually remembered quite clearly our conversation. I've thought about it many times of sort of how do we finance self-defense classes, right? It's such a simple thing of all these folks offering self-defense classes in whatever version of a YMCA or a community center.
But they're not all good. Not all self-defense classes are created
Fair enough. Right, exactly. We had a cool conversation though of like, how would you actually design a financing mechanism so that the good ones actually could grow in response to need, but that's a kind of a micro business often, or an informal business sometimes, that is not thought of. And so that's a great transition. And I'm so glad you're here, because we've been
I'm glad I got I literally was about to walk out the door when the message popped up on my phone saying, you've got to call in 2 minutes. I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna sit back down. So I'm glad.
Right. Well, let's dive in. And in our practice of how to dive in, I do want us to start with the acknowledgement. And so if you can, lift your hands off the keyboard and take hold of your own hand, however is comfortable for you. So we are not alone. We have power in our hands. This is not a light topic. And in this conversation, we will intellectualize and abstract a set of very real experiences. These discussions may trigger a wide range of emotions. In this room, statistically, are many survivors of gender-based violence. And we all participate in social, political, cultural, and economic systems that give permission for and facilitate violence. 80% of the estimated 800,000 people trafficked annually are women and girls. 79% of those are trafficked for sexual exploitation. A moment of silence to acknowledge the violence happening in this precise moment, somewhere, to someone. So now, reverse your hands. Notice the difference. We've come together to create new possibilities to address the epidemic of violence in our world and connect it in new ways. We can do even more. So let us begin. So, got a couple parts that I want to walk through, sort of a structure for this. I have a plan for this conversation, obviously. So 3 parts. One is I want to think about, so the first part is thinking about investing in companies that have an intentional impact on gender-based violence. So part of what impact investing needs to sort of is that kind of people going to transform things, right? People going to create change. So thinking about who are the companies that are actually intentionally, by the purpose of their company, not by their workplace practices that they somehow don't have as much sexual harassment, but literally the purpose of the company is to make a difference on gender-based violence. And we've actually been collecting these examples for a while now, and so I'm going to share with you a new publication that we've got coming out. I feel like we're having all of these conferences are such a way to kind of sort of concentrate getting stuff done and get it out in the world. So you're actually the first ones to see this new thing. So we've been building out this portfolio for a couple years, and I think it's a good illustration. But in that conversation of companies making a difference on gender-based violence, I also want to think not just about scalable entrepreneurial activities, but other things that sort of might broaden our scope of how to invest in companies directly that are making a difference. The second place that I want to take us to then is that impact investing is also a field of innovation that incents different kinds of innovation, right? We do challenges, we have accelerators, and what might be possible to use the broader field, because if we didn't have companies that we could invest in clean tech, we'd run an accelerator to get a bunch of companies together and accelerate their growth so we could invest in them. So how do we think about impact investing, not just like, what are the things that we can invest in, but also saying, how do we use the system of innovation? So that's the second part. And then the third part is, and we'll see, this is ambitious to get there in an hour and a half. So the third part is then thinking about, for impact investors, making investments in other arenas, housing, economic empowerment. How do we get impact investors to recognize that any investment that they make has a connection to gender-based violence? And so what can we do to make that shift? So, sound like a good plan? Anything else you really were hoping? Great, that's a plan then. Oh, LD, did you want to add anything that's coming? Sorry, I didn't include you in the list. Anything that you want to bring in from other conversations here?
I think probably just learning so many things about how the data points around GBV can also be an indicator for market stability. That was a moment for my learning. I think Tia shared that in Convo 1. And I think as well, just I'm still wrestling with the idea of the push and pull behind survivors and their experience and sharing that information, putting the burden of sharing their experience on their shoulders versus the need for public awareness to galvanize movement towards solutions, and how that hasn't been figured out totally. So yeah.
Which I think that question very much ties back to Rosalind, your question around how do we make sure that what is the connection to grassroots organizations that's also meaningful? All right, so let's maybe start back and say, so let's actually start maybe by sharing this deck. Can drop it in into the chat, and you should be able to get to it. And LD, I'm just going to ask you to take it out of the link, out of the Word document right now, because it just skewed all my formatting. So if you can take it back out. So if you click through to this, what we've done over the last couple years is we took the WHO. So the first thing we needed to do was figure out on what basis were we saying that people were making a difference on gender-based violence. And so this second slide, can you all open it? Did that work? Anybody need me to share a screen? We good? Rosalind, you got it open? You set? Maybe. All right, you'll let me know. So we took the WHO's framework of what are the things that make a difference on gender-based violence. And this is a little bit of a challenge, right? Because, well, took forever to figure out. Just really glad the WHO came out with this framework. But it's a little bit hard because, in fact, anything in theory that is addressing women's economic empowerment appropriately would be making a difference on gender-based violence. But we sort of made this screen of not intentionally, right? There might be saying we're making a difference on gender-based, making a difference on women's economic empowerment, but without an intention of actually thinking about how it connects. It's a little bit of a thin piece. I don't know, I want to just take a moment and scroll through this. There's, like, I love this, you know, the WPI series, right? This is the Women's Property Initiative. It's just an amazing organization in Australia that's sort of working to address questions of housing. The C-Note, for those of you, I think a lot of folks in the States know this, but C-Note is a new company who, well, not that new, maybe a couple of years now, but Catherine's been working on, excuse my language, but she calls it the Women's Individual, I'll just F-off fund. So that what's the money that you have in savings that lets you walk away from a situation? So really thinking about how to design financial services for women. Free From is very similar to that. The next one, interesting, like, I mean, at some level we dropped Kiva in here just because there is a broad-based awareness of gender-based violence within Kiva. Could take that up for grabs and whether or not how intentional they actually are. Callisto is a very famous, actually famous in the US at least, in terms of lots of investment has actually moved to Callisto as a sort of an online app, making a difference. Actually, Big Mountain Data is incredible of just kind of feeding information about violence and violence prevention to governments. There's this, the scrolling a little bit forward, one of my favorite ones in here is down to slide 18. Vikrant has been building this organization. I don't know if you know them, Udit. It's yeah, so this sort of fight back of self-defense classes and really trying to scale that throughout India, and Vikrant's been growing very quickly. And doing some really interesting stuff. The background is he was actually providing a, he was running a security business and started training people to be security guards. And one of my favorite parts of his overall story is he figured out that he was providing these self-defense classes and training people who worked in, oh my goodness, I always forget the name. What's the word where, strip bars, right? So people who were strippers working in bars turned out to be really amazing security guards. And so they sort of taught them, and that sort of led into maybe what he should just be doing is teaching people self-defense classes and broader. But it kind of interesting, just trying to solve a problem in his own business led to this other piece. Anyway, so you can sort of see where this is headed. One other one that I wanted to point out.
And I've just noticed in the chat, Udit is one of the investors in Fight Back.
Well, just come up here and say stuff like that. That's cool. Well done. A huge fan of it, Grant. The other one that's not, I'm just not seeing it.
We actually were what allowed them to trigger the funding from the Grand Canada, whatever it was.
Oh, the Grand Challenges Canada. Gotcha. It's a lot of people in Toronto that are being referenced here, because I think Devin, Regina, LD, all in Toronto, and now we've got another one. Grand Challenges Canada. So the other piece that is, we've also been putting together what are the funds, and so I'll just name this. There is a new media platform in New York that is specifically investing in films that are addressing gender norms. So you can go in these different directions. I don't know, what comes up when you see this portfolio? What are the possibilities or the constraints within it? From maybe thinking a little bit Regina or Lauren or Siri or Teen from a sort of, Devin, from an investor perspective. What are the strengths or challenges in what's here?
Yeah, maybe I can just kick off with a thought. So from my perspective, I'm thinking about what is the right type of capital that fits the needs of the organization? What is the ability of the organization to generate cash to pay back the returns to that investor? And I think Regina's point earlier about what's the right vocabulary to use for different types of investors is very important. I had no idea so many really interesting companies exist. That's why I'm looking forward to the data that you're going to share. Because for me, I would like to be able to understand, well, what's the universe of potential investments that DSC could invest in and bring others into, and then sort of figure out where does our capital fit best. But one thing I just want to note on that is our capital often is very, we're a political organization, we're a government agency, so we're subject to the strategy and the objectives of particular administration. And so I wish that our capital is much more flexible, but I have to realize that it isn't always. So I think what comes to mind here is, how do you match the right type of capital to these potential opportunities?
Right.
I would add to that and credit you, Joy, for already doing half the work by pointing out which organizations are for profit and which ones are non-profit, because that's the very first easy distinction, right? And then I also would say, Lauren, that if DFC is really to start deploying equity, then you are in a whole different game, right? And then this would open up a whole lot of new opportunities. What jumped out to me when I looked at these organizations is that there's such a broad variety of things that companies can be doing to address gender-based violence, right? And then some of those are rather direct, like self-defense courses, but others may be indirect by just employing people who have such an experience, or also by just donating a percentage of whatever profits they have to that cause, right? And so I think like that just opened up my mind as to what types of things we may be seeing even on our platform that already do something to fight gender-based violence. I just haven't pointed that out yet. So that's really interesting to me.
Or, and this is maybe coming into later parts of the conversation, or there's a conversation that there's a company that right now, and this is true of a lot of fintech companies, right, that is completely unaware of gender-based violence right now. But if thought for 5 minutes about the ways in which the sort of data safety and all the rest of it that goes with a sort of, this is where I think this is the transition between this one and the next part of our conversation of what would it take to innovate just a little bit so that it could be more intentionally making a difference. But and Lauren, I think that's part of the, how do we signal with capital to say we're looking for these kinds of companies to make these kinds of adjustments, and then they would fit in this mix. Devin.
Yeah, I'll just add 2 thoughts. Yeah, one thing that strikes me is these are very small organizations. Many are 1 to 10 employees. So the issue for investors being just like the transaction size to make a return on such a thing. But perhaps it just makes me think, like, if we had more intermediaries, like a fintech GBV firm that like was able to kind of cultivate those relationships with these types of organizations and do a lot of that capacity building and vetting, kind of what maybe this is linking into your later points. But that's, at least from Mita's perspective, we're shifting towards trying to finance intermediaries as opposed to direct investments, because it seems to be more sustainable, it diversifies risk, and it lowers the transaction fees, among other benefits. So I just think that's something that struck me in looking at the deck. The one other thing I'll say, just kind of jumped out with me with Kiva, and any of these kinds of institutions that are providing micro-lending or financing for women entrepreneurs or women's economic empowerment, as we do at Mita. There's a lot of evidence out there about questioning whether, as you increase women's economic empowerment, it can increase violence against women. It can increase and it can decrease it depending on context and other factors. So something, I guess, for us to kind of be careful about as we, maybe back to your point around intentionality and being accountable to that intention. That there are, in fact, actual positive impacts, and it's not creating more damage.
And if possible, I'd like to add that, one of the things that we're trying to address in the work we're doing with organizations is that if you're empowering women and girls and you're not giving them the skills to navigate the world safely, you're looking at a 30% loss in your investment to start with. Because if you think about the statistics of 1 in 3 women are going to experience. So if you're working with 12 to 15-year-old girls who may not yet have been victims of violence, and you're not mitigating the risk of gender-based violence and or sexual assault, you're already buying into a 30% loss on your investment. And how do we make sure that that's not what we're doing? That we're looking at
some percentage of a 30% loss, right? Just to do the math in my head, right? It wouldn't be that your whole investment in those people would be lost, but their earning power would go down.
It's not just their earning power. It's their, I think as someone who is a survivor and works with survivors, right? The person who is now post domestic abuse or post sexual assault, who was given all the wonderful economic incentives and tools and things you gave them beforehand, is not going to be able to use those tools in the way that you had originally hoped for them to do so. So, and what we know from research is that women who have learned, girls who have learned self-defense and were not capable of stopping violence, the healing is deeper and faster. So there's support saying that if you give them the skills, even if they fail, you have given them the ability, the resiliency to move on with the economic skills that you were trying to give them to begin with.
Right.
So that part of the work that we're trying to do is how to package that together. That, It's like giving people driver's licenses, but not teaching them how to drive safely.
Right. Yep. And I think there's so back to, I think some of these, I want to keep coming back to that, because I think there's something in that about how do we find places where investment capital is moving and making claims about the impact they're having on the lives of women and girls, and figure out how do we add a gender-based violence screen into that. I want to come back to that at the, in a bit, but keep flagging that. I do want to name, so Devin, too, these are smaller organizations. Some of it is, one is we need to keep checking the data, because Kiva says it's 1 to 10 employees, and that's not true. So now I'm looking at like the first time I've put this up. So how about we go back through and check it before we put it out more broadly? The second thing is, some of these are startups, right? And so like what we were trying to find was kind of the startup-y look, right? Who could take on a significant amount of capital as part of a growth strategy. Yeah, T.
Exactly what I wanted to say. I wondered if you had any kind of data that shows where of that, are there 30 or so of those companies, where they got their initial, whatever it was that they needed, that one bit of funding that started them off. I wondered if there was a sort of pattern there, just because, one of my biggest frustrations is always people talk about risk and to the point, I get it, to Lauren's point, you can only do what you're, within your framework. And part of Rockflower strategy is we hang it way out there and take bets on people that nobody else is prepared to take a bet on. But and that's fine, that's the structure that we have. But I'd be really interested to see, within that group of 30, is there a pattern where people get their sort of first bits? I mean, I know people talk about friends and family, whatever, but that's a very broad spectrum of companies. So I'd just be really interested in that.
Yeah, I think that's great. Rosalind, do you want to throw in what your comment is here?
Yeah, I just listening to the whole conversation, and I'm really picking a lot from it. Is one starting point, and I've noticed one of the organizations that is becoming very popular in the region in East Africa is Segal Foundation. And one of the things they did is that they brought in a number of grassroots women representatives that included also victims of sexual gender-based violence into their boardship and into their committees. And that transformed the whole scope of how they were looking at both their investment and their grants in the region. So through that process, they created something called unrestricted funding, so that the organization could either build, maternity hospitals, they could build schools, they could build hotels. In that way, these women could get employed, and then therefore they would just narrow that gap. But all this information came in because they brought in the experts that were not considered experts in, ordinarily in this kind of scenario where we are in this geography.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's such a great simple suggestion to say, to what in looking at a company that's claiming to make a difference on gender-based violence, it does seem like a clear due diligence question is, what's your permanent expertise? Who are you partnering with to make sure it's not just a single experience? So I want to throw in one other set, because part of it is, I think it might actually be useful if we organize these kind of, it's very helpful to think we could organize these into sort of types of companies, right? So they were a little more clustered, because you do have a set of like online apps. Obviously, most apps are online. So there's sort of online data sharing and those platforms, which are important and have limits, right? So one of the concerns within, I was on a panel at Women Deliver on sort of gender-based violence and innovation. And in that, the kind of, we don't need that many more apps to tell people where it's dangerous. They're good, but we can't solve gender-based violence through a bunch of apps. in general, I don't know how much we can solve gender-based violence through one-off companies in general that need to scale a lot to make a difference. The second piece, though, I wanted to throw in here is looking for these types of companies, right? As we start thinking about what are the types of companies that could make a difference, I want to throw in this other list, which is companies that are, just dropping this into the chat as another set of ideas of, we were trying to think about categories of companies where you could put investment in, and they would maybe be at a different level of scale, potentially, right? So one is you do have service companies that are providing services to corporations, right? They're sort of broad-based training companies, right? Some of them are quite small, and this is a case where it's a kind of a category. Devin, building on your idea of, could there be a financial intermediary that says, we're going to work on financing these kinds of businesses? The second idea, and you keep coming up with these, like ad agencies that are building out a kind of a line of work on more gender responsive advertising, or looking at media companies that are shifting gender norms. You could keep thinking about other ideas like that, of finding a category of company that you could then build a kind of investment thesis around and say, we're going to invest in a bunch of media companies for the purpose of using our capital to push them to build out something that they wouldn't have necessarily been able to build out before. Because back to the gender expertise thing, lots of things we hear from businesses is, well, I'd love to do that, but I have no ability in my current capability to do X, Y, or Z. And so anyway, other thoughts, I don't know, we could brainstorm on this list. Are there other categories of companies that are addressing gender-based violence, as you're saying, Lauren, thinking holistically? T?
If I can just jump in, but I was wondering this morning, does anybody know of any companies that use behavioral economics to address gender-based violence? I don't know if that's something, but if you think about how, somebody like Dr. Valerie Hudson, I know that you do a lot of work with her. I was listening to her last Friday. She was on something and talking about, we keep bringing it back to the household, okay? And if you're looking at the way that economics is changing, you've got Kate Raworth and donut economics and all of that mindset now of economists changing the way we've always thought about economists. That New York Times article about the Milton Friedman essay 50 years on, it just got me thinking, well, if we're moving that way, then surely behavioral economics is exactly the thing that we need to use to address something like gender-based violence.
I love that. Other thoughts? Right, it's a great kind of tangible, investment, I would say the other related piece to that is artificial intelligence, right? So investments in AI are officially not looking at gender-based violence across the board, right? And to a real devastation, right? These kind of, the example of like, let me find my car, I want to know where my car is. Or that can be turned into a predatory rape tool, just because, somebody wants to, there was an app that was created that literally was, here is all of where my possessions are. Because, there's essentially some sense of, I want to show off where all my possessions are. And where am I in relationship to all of those possessions? Which then opens up a set of exploitation. Other thoughts? Areas of innovation?
Look, sorry, someone was going to say.
Oh, go ahead.
One of the things, there's definitely some packaging that needs to happen to kind of group some of these investments and different products or different different ways that investors want to put their money in versus the stage of where some of these companies are. So there's some crossing and cutting and sort of grouping that needs to happen, I think. And then I've been in my mind, given I think I'm the only Australian on this call, you know, how do we build this across countries, or precedents across countries as well? Because, you know, there was an Australian company in there, but a lot of them were not Australian. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, impact investors I know here, what is it that's ready in Australia versus what might impact investors in Australia be investing in overseas, and how can we start to build some of those global precedents and scale across countries in different, you know, funders investing in different organizations or coming together. Joy, as you've talked about, to fund accelerator programs. So that's sort of where my mind has been wandering, if you like, in this conversation. And perhaps how can you start with a portfolio of companies like that and almost say, okay, well, let's run a prototyping of this. Well, how might this work? And then how could we put it out and test it with different investor groups to get feedback, just a prototype on a smaller level? Because otherwise, you know, there's just so many different opportunities and so many even different industries with where those companies sit, and it feels big. You know, the conversation feels big.
Yeah, no, I think the packaging is a really key point. And part of it is we were glad to, I mean, when we first started working on this portfolio, we didn't know if we'd find any companies making difference in gender-based violence, right? Like, it's not like it's a hot topic within impact investing where everybody's talking about, well, we've had 16 accelerators and we've all been building these companies. So we were really like, I don't know, that's why we followed around Vic Current for so long. But the setting up insurance plans, all right, I like these ideas. Say them out loud.
Yeah, maybe I can start with the moving company. So this is actually inspired by one of the companies in your portfolio here, which is Meathead Movers. I'd never even thought about that connection, but to me, it totally makes sense that survivors of gender-based violence would need to move in many cases, right? And I find that moving companies is a place where you can totally work with debt and equity. It's not like moving companies normally don't need grant finance, right? So to me, that is one place where, as an impact investor, it may be something that is additional to your current portfolio, because I don't think a lot of impact investors will have moving companies in their portfolio, but it may be a way how you as an impact investor can really make a change. Because if you go to that moving company, you say, look, if you are ready to provide your services at a reduced or cost-free price to those survivors, then we are ready to provide you with debt or equity, right? So it would be a win-win. Like, moving company would get money from a source that it currently is not tapping, maybe at even a concessional rate. And for this, at the same time, the impact investor is enhancing its portfolio, diversification, and so on, and is maybe also doing something like below, like above and beyond what it's currently doing. So that to me sounded like a really interesting thing that could hold potential for even more in a sector that I, at least at Convergence, haven't seen at all tapping into any type of impact money. Or
what if it's a hybrid, back to your blended model, right? So what if, and Devin, I think about a lot of the stuff that META does out in the ground. What if it was a foundation that said, because part of the problem is nobody wants survivors as customers, right? They're not, let's just face it, it's not a desirable, will they pay? Are there risks involved? That's just, there's going to be a lot of fears on the part of the companies to go in that direction. But what if there was a philanthropist who said, you know what, I want to pay, I want to create a fund that actually enables people in my community to get access to free moving services, right? Because getting the ability to move is an ability to get out of a situation. But then partnering with the moving company to say, I'll provide it through this company, which is actually, if you paid it up front, it would be a form of financing for the business, because it would be essentially cash flow financing, right? You'd give them the money up front to spend down, and that would be a significant investment, even though they're giving the money, even though they're giving the services away. You know what I mean? So you're sort of paying for, how do we play that off? You had an idea. Somebody threw out another idea of insurance plans for IPV.
We have insurance plans for every other crisis Why aren't we building a balanced premium for the need to leave one day, if that should be my need, so that I will not be financially dependent?
Actuarially, that could work. I mean, especially if you had factors that said, have you taken a self-defense class? Which would be weird. Okay, that starts to get weird of like, if you can defend yourself, then we'll incent you, which has some unintended consequences in what we're communicating to women, but.
Yes, because what it's saying is that the chances are you're going to need to run away one day. Now that sucks. I mean, in trying to design the optimal world, I should be able to stay in my home with my children, and the perpetrator should have to prove his way back.
Yeah.
And that's a flip that I don't see happening in the next century. But it's a flip that should happen, because the system as it's set up today is actually continuing to persecute the person who is not at fault. But that's a whole different conversation.
Fascinating. So, Rosalind, can you just use this sort of creating safe, shame-free cultures? Where's that quote from? How's that? Was that up in the chat? I just missed it. Oh, got it.
Yeah, but let me add something on what Edith just said. I think for our work with widows, we tell married women this all the time. Prepare that one day your husband is going to die. And so before he dies, do you have insurance? Do you have a job? Do you have skills? Do you have education? Do you own the title of, do you know where the title is? Do you know how to pay your bills? Do you know who is your landlord? So it's a question we're already asking women. It's a difficult question, but I think it's the conversation. How then do we make the hard questions become palatable to women who are likely to be victims of gender-based violence?
Gotcha. Let me drop in just.
I like the shame-free culture.
Yeah, I like it too. I like it too. Let me just drop in a few other ideas into the chat. I realize I'm sort of doing this one at a time, but I'll drop these in. These are the other ideas that we've seen. Oh, education for male. Yeah, I would love for Lauren, you're suggesting that men would pay for that. Who would pay?
Well, I was just thinking about Rosalind's comment, and so I think that if men are thinking about the household and how the household functions together, and our partners are jointly planning for the household and how the household thrives, then having education and training for men to think differently about their masculinity. I'm thinking about the work of Gary Barker and Pro Mundo, and using that as kind of a lever for moving the conversation at the household level. That's just a thought that kind of sparked in my mind.
Sorry, I'm going to drop in, that's great. I'm going to drop in the last one, and then you can see some of these sort of, for the sake of, these are just some of the ideas that we've been bouncing around. One of my favorites was the accelerator on neuroplasticity, because we do actually know that our brains can recover from trauma, but we invest very little. And actually that's kind of, that would be, neuroplasticity is actually a pretty significant business. It's in sort of medical devices. And so how can we move that forward? So this is kind of getting to the question of how could we get the field of impact investing? Is it worth it? Is it possible to get the field of impact investing thinking more of this as a sort of category of innovation? There's many ways to sort of think about this, but to say what impact investing often does is spur innovation. Could we could we shape impact investing to think about gender-based violence as an area of innovation? And if so, what would that take?
Just a quick thought on Judith's point and Rosalie's about insurance. I mean, almost, and to Sarah's point about packaging, it's almost like you're thinking about what are the things that you need as you know, in your kind of toolbox, as you have your own toolbox, but almost to the point of, I'm thinking bank accounts, you know, and, you know, what could you create? What could you design? You know, not just the F off a bank account, but something else that's you know, that's maybe where you go into a JP Morgan and Chase and say, look, you know, you're this huge bank or whatever it is, whatever financial institution that's trying to have a different slant. I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but you know what I mean? Like, which parts of the box do you need? You know, as somebody who had to pick up my 4 children and leave something, that was the most difficult thing, is being able to access those bits of the puzzle. So I think that would be just really helpful to, you know, to look at it and design that. You need an insurance policy, you need a bank, you need all those things. Maybe it exists already.
Part of that issue, though, is legislating owned property. So, you know, as long as our marriage is looked at in a certain way under the law within a certain country, my assets are ours until, so there's where it gets a little tricky. But when we talk about crisis insurance, you know, hurricane insurance, fire insurance, theft insurance, there are other crises in the world that are not of our making. You know, someone, you know, becoming violent or leaving us penniless is a crisis that has to be navigated. And why is this crisis not considered as important as other crises? I think that's, at some point, I'd love to just share, we started a global movement, which is starting to build steam. And on September 26th, we're launching a pitch competition for innovative ideas in violence prevention education. And I'd love to share the link because I think you should all know about it.
Yeah.
And I'll be bold enough to say we are looking for judges. So if that is something that sounds exciting to somebody, we're looking for mentors and judges for, it's a month-long process where they get help developing their ideas and their concepts. And this is global. So if it's, I'll put the link here so you can have fun taking a look.
Great. Well, you're also, make sure to use, now that you're landed and you can fully participate, this workplace thing is a place that you can go and post this and actively recruit judges and get what you need. Very cool. Devin, I'm loving this conversation. I need another cup of coffee to multitask quite as much of how rich the chat is while the main conversation. Devin, I love that idea. And Rosalind, that's genius. Let's do that. Let's go do that. That'd be great. I think what was the phrase that was in the survivor lens conversation? It was not a spectrum, the continuum, right? And so it's that continuum, right? That's what if you take that continuum, this idea of what happens along each step of the path, really interesting. You could just sit here and watch the chat. Anybody want to say these? Devin, can you talk a little bit about this? What's Brighter Investments?
Sure, and I think there's models in the States that do this as well, and I see Regina's posted another link, which would be interesting to hear about. Essentially what Brighter Investments does is they're based in Vancouver, but they finance students' education in, I think, predominantly West Africa. and this is post-secondary education. And so once they graduate from university, they get a great job and, like, you know, being an agroecologist or something like that, then they are able to, a portion of their income is paid back to Brighter Investments. And Brighter Investments has attracted some institutional capital recently in the last few years, so that they are seen as a pretty effective intermediary. And so what I like about it is really dependent on the success of the individual, right? It's basing the student on getting a well-paying job that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to pay for their education. So is there potentially a parallel with the survivor journey, where, you know, I think that what's I'm hearing a lot about is that, you know, that they're in a very vulnerable position early on in their experience, and they really, you know, there is an ability to pay, there isn't an economic argument, but if there were enough, you know, investments and wraparound supports.
Oh, sometimes it just catches up eventually, and if you listen really hard, it'll be all of a sudden, it'll say that all really fast. Wraparound supports, Devin, right? That's what we need. That's where we lost you.
Sorry, yeah, I got booted off. Yeah, just that you bring in those wraparound supports, you take on the risk of the survivor up front. And as they succeed in their pathways of creating the life they want to live, there is participation in the, like, you know, if it was a job or what have you, there is participation by the investor in that success as well, so that the incentives are aligned.
Yeah, and I was adding to that we have a member in our network too called Chanson, which do a similar model in Rwanda. And I actually find it fascinating because they basically calculate the percentage of the income at a later stage, once that person has found employment, that it will have to pay back over a number of years and so on. And when I look closer, I also saw that one of the two schools that they are cooperating with at the moment is completely girls only. And so I do think that if you would further narrow it down, and maybe it's even a start, right, to start with girls only schools, maybe then you'll already catch a lot of people you are potentially preventing from ever experiencing gender-based violence just by having them have access to that education in the first place. And then in that context also, I'm just noting here the link for the GINS co-investment convening. This is kind of convenings under the R3 coalition as COVID response, basically, where they invite investors only to present transactions that could be relevant to other investors as well, in order to try to, you know, to expedite the matchmaking. And in this case, I think UBS Optimus Foundation will present Chanson International because they are an investor in their model. So I think that's a totally valid proposal. And I think there is a lot of value from the education sector. And in this case, the cash flow is rather direct. It's debt, right? Like you take on a credit. And in the US, for example, you get that all the time, just as a student by virtue of the education system. But maybe in Africa, it's different, right? It's not that easy to get access to that type of credit. And so I think that's a model that is totally relevant in this context.
Well, and I just think about that whole category of people. I mean, indeed, I'm coming back to your comment, which I'll think about for a long time, of like, and I think I'm now understanding your point, right? So all these people are investing in girls' education and saying, you will pay back at this point when your life is more successful as a result of our education. Nobody is in that. I have been in a lot of those conversations. I don't hear anybody managing for gender-based violence in that context, right? There is a kind of assumption that things will be smooth. And since you brought up student debt, I will say one of the ideas that Criterion is actually most committed to trying to figure out how to implement is, how do we design a student debt mechanism for the United States that actually gives people the the statistics are pretty significant, but women take out more student debt in the United States, and they keep it longer because their incomes are lower, so they pay more interest and they pay out payments for a longer period of time. And so in the United States, student debt to for-profit universities is the highest single cause of homelessness in the United States for women. And so how do we intersect that? And there's a lot of data about how that intersects with gender-based violence. So you take somebody from the age of 21 to 45, 50, right? The number of situations that they're going to need to escape from in that period of time is pretty significant. And the Australian examples of NAB and others have actually proven that offering leniency at moments of crises from banks actually works. So I'm sorry, it's our little obsession of my personal obsession. I'm not gonna actually, most people in Criterion are like, yeah, whatever, Joanne, I'm not sure that's gonna work. But my basic idea is, could we do a campaign on college campuses to have them advocate for more choices in student debt, to say, we demand something that's more compassionate, to recognize that during that time period, there's going to be a crisis for half the population, whether they have to leave a job because it's violent, or they have to leave a home, or they have to leave a neighborhood. So how do we, but those that just gets to, and struck you, Date, on this point of like, let me see if I said it right. Why is this crisis not seen as one that we need to, what was the end of that? Finance, respond to, manage for?
Mitigate. You know, it's an impending crisis that we can, in many cases, I am audacious enough to say, in the majority of cases, we could mitigate.
Right.
And yet we're not doing the amount of, you know, when builders started dying on the job, OSHA we put together OSHA and 1,001 training programs to make sure that they wore hard hats and they did everything they needed to do to stay safe.
Right.
There's not been a system where there's been a health crisis where we have not come up with some sort of prevention strategy. For some reason, when it comes to GBV and all of its friends, IPV, DV, and trafficking, our responses are only to fix the broken people and not investing in how do we change the system so that fewer people are going into that system. And it blows my mind. I mean, to me, this is the largest health issue, much larger than COVID. And we can't get people to look at the prevention side of it. Right. We only in the recognition, removal, and rehabilitate. And that's bad business. It also leaves the world with a bunch of really sad, broken, miserable, horrible lived people. And we don't want that. So how do we do better?
Well, and I think it's just worth naming also, like, some of this, I think, yes, we need to do more on the prevention side. I also think one of my takeaways from this, because I often lead towards prevention of like, how do we just have this not happen at all? But the flip side is, I just think there's so many of these ideas that are really powerful about how do you enable people to get out of the situation faster, which makes the impact short. At least the ability to leave, the ability to step out of a situation, the ability to respond when it happens, keeps the cycle of it happening over and over again to get that broken. So how do we sort of facilitate choice?
Can we go back to the insurance discussion? Because I think that is really sort of central to this question. I'm fascinated by this. I don't know much about the insurance industry and how it works, but from comments people were making, using insurance as a way to be resilient in the face of such physical and emotional trauma seems to be one way that you would allow people to leave a traumatic situation, because they would have the confidence of having the resources they need in order to be able to leave. And so I'm wondering whether at some point a conversation with either an insurance company that has been thinking about this issue, I don't know if any have, but and there's an investor group some of you might know called Leapfrog. Leapfrog invests in emerging markets, and then a number of their investments, their first investments, were in insurance companies. And I wonder whether a conversation with Andy Cooper about this particular issue would bear some fruit.
Right, right. Well, and I think that's sort of the exactly, you're leading to the third part of conversation that we don't quite have time for, of like, how do we actually just talk to the people already doing this stuff in impact investing and say, Andy, or the amazing first investor in Andy's business, Sari Miller, who lives in New York, and like gave him the first money to get going. Like, how do we say, what else is possible here? You've innovated 85 times of sort of these platforms. What more could you innovate? I will say Allstate in the US is a significant player. Purple, I'm gonna not get the name of their program, but they're a significant philanthropic player on gender-based violence. And we're starting a conversation that the woman at Allstate we've been talking to pretty regularly is sort of making some introductions inside of Allstate to play out a different idea. We were actually going to talk to her about a reinsurance product for infrastructure. This might be another thing to bring and think about what were the other approaches.
Was it Purple Purse, Joy?
Purple Purse, yes. That I think got renamed as something else, or maybe it got renamed. And that's it. So we have 12 minutes left. Rosalind.
I love the thought and the last question and what Lorena said.
Oh, can you lean a little bit more into your computer? It works better sometimes. Oh, thank you.
My thought from the context of where I work and live, and also as a survivor, is insurance is just one bit. I think if you want to look at the whole, first you're a victim, then you become a survivor. You will need reproductive health, you will need health, you will need insurance, you will need capital, you will need education and skills, you will need legal services, you will need a support system, you will need to understand, know your rights. So it's like a holistic approach to how to come from healing to understanding yourself, self-discovery, and then to healing. And so when you are at healing, then you can later now then become productive, you can generate income, you can take a loan, you can go sell your wares in the market. So I see like it's a holistic approach than just one snippet of it. So if you lose the rest, you will still not holistically bring this woman from a victim to a survivor.
Yeah, I think it's really well said. What that triggered for me is so it triggered for me because my response to that was, right, but that's a social service job. That's what governments need to be funding. That's what we would need philanthropy to support, to sort of take that person through the life cycle, through that continuum. And then I thought, no, like there's a whole bunch of points along that process where there could be for-profit solutions, right? Because some of that is just, this is a rights-based issue. Your rights have been violated. Therefore, the government has failed to protect your rights. Therefore, the government should step in and do something to help you recover from the thing that they did not protect you from, right? That's one way to look at it. The second way is are there innovations that could reduce the cost of those services, make them more efficient, finance them in different ways? And that's the, without naming the you're off the hook government and civil society for this rights-based solution. And that's the tension to keep going of like, how do we not turn this into, how do we make money on survivors, right? Which would then take us all in this weird mindset. And yet, are there more sustainable systems within it that, I'm sorry, that's my, that back and forth moment. I'll be quiet.
I don't want to take all this space, but what I see there, especially listening to, is the first conversation for me that I'm ever in a space where impact investors are present. What I hear there is, can we do hostels? Can we set up hostels and they come in with insurance at a reduced rate? Can we set up skill-based centers in their communities where they can literally walk there? They don't need to take public transport and pay their $1. Can we then, provide a legal, I can't think forward, but I see the opportunities there. Can we then create a community-based center where you subsidize some costs and the other costs are paid for? So you still, money doesn't die, because the only challenge, even for me as at Rona Foundation, is that grants die. You don't want money to die. You want money to live and live and live. So even today, Joy, and this is the first news I'm sharing, we got our first grant, Give Women Loans, from a widow organization, a small philanthropic organization. And this loan is going to resuscitate and create and grow from one widow to, they have to be in a group. So we are looking at that structure. What can we create? Is going to be not die, but live as the victims to survivors and to heal and thrive.
Yeah.
And
I really love your work. I really do. It's just amazing.
Yeah, I'd like to bounce off the idea of the moving company is, why can't we get a dozen chains of motels to be willing to do their social their social responsibility work in giving 30 days free to whoever needs to escape? A lot cheaper than keeping, shelters running. But that there's some investment made that here you're putting your SDG money into a pot so that you can spend it down, or, as women who need to escape with their families can spend their first 30 days knowing that they're safe for 30 days, and then can work out their plans and figure out their systems and get the support that they need.
So many ideas. So many ideas. And that builds off, Rosalind, off your shelter idea. How do we continue to work on building safe spaces? In the last 6 minutes, what are you taking from this conversation? Team, go ahead, go with me.
Just so much. Yeah, it's going to take me an hour to just read through all of this and digest it, but just really helpful to hear everyone's perspective and get, I think it was a really rich conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think this conversation helped me find all the ways how gender-based violence is already included in some of the business models that I see in my daily life, and despite me not being able to recognize it earlier. And I've been trying to get into gender as a whole impact investing theme. So I think I'm already happy that I can now identify that education has to do with women, and that I then discover that these are women-only schools, for example, which they don't tell you at the outset, which is, I think, something they should be doing. So that's now my part, right? I go to them and I tell them, hey, you have to mention that it's a girls only school, right? This will help you a lot when in your fundraise. But now I can go even a step further and say, look, you're also potentially contributing to reducing or at least mitigating gender-based violence through the things that you're already doing, right? So I think there's a lot that I can now see that potentially was hidden before, and where I see that we can take that forward.
Yeah, Joy, I'm, sometimes I find these conversations quite overwhelming because it's so big what we're talking about. But I've actually seen some really practical examples in this conversation that have given me a lot of hope and actually some excitement. And there's a real opportunity here for innovation, as you've been saying, and some very interesting new business models and services that could emerge that can adapt from what we've already got in the current system, but just be adapted now that we've got a much better understanding of some of these opportunities, like moving companies, like insurance. So I think that's really exciting.
Yeah. Can I just build on this Lauren and Devin thing? Yes, let's do that before Convergence ends. Let's actually get a survivor map and map things against it. I will, right? LD, we can start working on that today, get it organized, start mapping some of these ideas against it. That's why we're doing Convergence. So let's do it.
Joy, and one example might be the map that was created for gender smart investing that Suzanne worked on. I don't know if that map works equally well here, but it was really helpful to kind of bring in the whole ecosystem and gender smart investing.
You mean the map of the capital markets?
And all the different players, and you could sort of create different nodes and connections amongst the players. It may or may not be a helpful example.
Yeah. I'll look back at it. It's actually up on my wall in front of me. It keeps me aware of the complexity of the world in which we live. But that's a Suzanne would be thrilled if we could connect back to that. Any other comments? Yudi, welcome to Convergence. This was a humdinger of a conversation for you to jump into.
Yes, I'm glad I decided to look at my phone before I walked out the door.
We're certainly glad you sat down. Oh, and Rosaline, thank you for your I think the work you do with widows is unbelievably thoughtful, and I'm so glad to start making these bridges. And I know the time you're taking out of your day is pretty rough given the intensity of your work. But I'm just so glad to have your voice in this room. Do you have any final thoughts?
My greatest takeaway is I'm thinking about how do you create, and I'm going to talk to you about this and connect with all of us. The GBV survivor toolkit. What does that look like? I would love to really maybe just to, talk it further, because I think that would be something that is a groundbreaking tool that may answer some of these questions in the future, because we're not creating for us now, we are creating into the future. So thank you all. I'm happy to be you and be in this space. I'm privileged to be in this space. Thank you.
Well, and that's we have this amazing partnership with this group of organizations in Kenya, where we're sort of looking to continue to say, how do we finance the reduction of gender-based violence and starting with the grassroots organizations, not starting with the investors. We're going to now start inviting some investors into our conversations, but we started with the grassroots organizations to really say, what does your world look like? And then how do we innovate from that? But now we're starting to make all of the connections. Hey, LD, do you have final thoughts on all of this?
That I think when we're leaving a strategy session with a clear idea of things we want to make, like this continuum of the survivor experience and the GBV survivor toolkit, that has probably been a really effective strategy session.
Right. There are direct investments that we can make that will address gender-based violence. And there's many other things that we can do. But in this category of kind of practical, we can put money in companies, and if those companies do more of what they're doing, it would make a difference. And I am much more, I will say, this part of our work has been somewhat challenging for me. And this conversation has just renewed my sense of how important it is and what we can do, and actually that it could be easier than I thought. So with that, let's keep this going and see you at the next conversation that you're in, and we will continue to connect around how to move these things forward immediately.
And I'll put the links from the chat in the group on Workplace for us all.
Yeah, because that was a humdinger of a chat.
I know. It's almost like an article.
Are we comfortable sharing this conversation? I know we were kind of wrestling through things, but you're good sharing it?
Sure.
Great. All right.
Lovely
Thanks for
meeting
staying up.
everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.